Hello, 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 everyone. My name is Matthew Terry, founder and CEO of Suade, and welcome to another episode of People in Sales, Not Salespeople, a podcast where we analyze the person behind the salesperson. And I'm really excited to have Jeff Bittner, director of DCP and Small Business, on the podcast. Jeff and I met 2 years ago. Can you believe it's been that long?
Feels longer,
Yeah.
but yeah.
I was like,
No,
was
it's been a great 2 years, my friend.
It's been a fantastic 2 years. And he's one of the most genuine people you'll ever meet. Super, super wise and a wizard when it comes to customer conversations and asking the right questions and just
Oh,
giving it.
thanks, man.
So I'm really excited to have you on and sort of glean some of your insights and share some of your insights. If you can, share some of the secret sauce to the world. So first and foremost, I would love to just kick it off. You'll understand why I asked this question in a bit, audience. But Jeff, tell us what you do at Brain Trust, and then tell us why you do it.
Well, Matthew, thank you. And, yeah, these last 2 years have been amazing. So for your audience members, just for their knowledge, you and I have had the opportunity to work together for over a year now. So Matthew, we actually brought on board to help build out an AI component piece inside of our digital academy, and it's one of the pieces that has been revolutionary for its success. And it continues to grow in strength and it continues to get better and better with each iteration. And so I was excited to be able to get on here and share a little bit about that. But so the work here at Brain Trust that I do is I really kind of specialize in our digital academy, which is designed specifically for individuals, small business teams, and actually full enterprise engagements. And it really just kind of depends on where a company is in the life of working with us that the DCP kind of comes into play. So that is that component. And then the small business component is we have an entire small business consulting division that helps not only with uh, training individuals on how to sell more effectively through our neuroselling framework, but also we have an entire program called NeuroGen, which is about actually helping them generate the leads. So we help all size companies with not only getting getting better swings at the plate, but getting more swings at the plate, if you will. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of what I do.
Yeah.
Why I do it is a really very different story. So I'm a Midwest guy. I'm from Cincinnati, born and raised here. Come from a relatively small family, except for my extended family is really large. So my immediate family is just I have an older brother and older sister, but I have a very large um, extended family. And growing up, when I did, I actually lived about 15 miles away from 23 of my first cousins. And so every weekend, if you can imagine, it was someone's birthday or some kind of event or something going on, right? And everything always took place at my grandpa's pool. So my grandfather was the owner of a construction company here in Cincinnati, small business, but very successful. And in my family, when you turned 13, you were what was called cheap manual labor, right? So I was brought in at the ripe age of 13. And man, I spent my summers hauling shingles up and down ladders and putting concrete in wheelbarrows and cleaning up job sites and just learning that world. And during my tenure of doing that, I had a chance to see how my grandfather ran his company. So my grandpa, even though he was a GC, he was very hands-on with his group. Every day he was out there working as hard, if not harder than anybody on his team. And they loved it. Didn't matter which crew he was on, didn't matter what we were doing. My grandfather was involved with it. It was where I learned what real servant leadership looked like, right? I also learned the power of encouragement because I wasn't great in the construction realm, but my grandpa would always come up and encourage me to continue to do better. Hey, you're on the right track, but maybe try using this penny nail instead. Hey, I know I didn't tell you to do this and you went ahead and did it anyway. Thank you for taking the initiative, but please stop. Right. So those type of engagements. And when I was 15, he ended up inviting me to sit on his back porch with him one day. And we sat back there and we drank our Palmers. And this gentleman shows up in this three-piece suit. To this day, I still don't know what company he represented. But my grandpa was in his regular blue jeans and his flannel shirt, and they sat there for about an hour, and I just kind of sat off to the side and listened. And what I didn't know is that my grandfather ran a small little consulting business on the side. I didn't know what business was consulting was at that time. But when he got done with this gentleman, because my grandfather, what people wanted to learn about him wasn't necessarily so much the numbers and the figures of why he was successful. It was how in the world did he run a construction company that at that point in time hadn't lost an employee in 5.5 years,
Mm,
which is unheard of in that space.
mhm.
And it was based on the values of what I saw him perform out on the job site every day. The servant leadership piece, he would encourage people consistently, and he was a big component of putting in a real, true hard day's work. And his team loved him for it. Every crew loved him for it. And so it inspired me to get into business consulting. I ended up going into that field and spent 15 years helping to run a consulting division here in Cincinnati before I came onto Brain Trust about 6 years ago to help build out the small business division here. So
Nice.
that's why I do what I do.
That's why you do what you do. Very
I,
powerful story. Very powerful story. It's is the story that's close to home for you, that shows your values and shows someone in your life that really poured into you, and it sort of wraps around very nicely around what you do today. So, love that story, man. And that story is Jeff's personal connection story. And they preach and teach that at Brain Trust to really help individuals build what was called rapport, but what is now called just authentic relationships within discovery calls. And I had the pleasure of really diving into how one structures and creates a personal connection story, in order to create an artificial intelligence that can actually generate people's personal connection stories. So during this next segment, I want to dive into that. I want to dive into the personal connection story and its effectiveness. Jeff, talk us about the power of a personal connection story, and then we can start diving into the science and how it actually works.
yeah. So let me piggyback off what you had just said right there, right? That I think a lot of new salespeople, it's always trying to figure out how can you create good rapport with somebody, right? And the problem with that type of mentality of creating rapport is that it's all about you, right? And it doesn't come back. It doesn't come off very genuine, right?
Mm,
So you end up getting in. Let's say you and I were connecting here the first time. So for people who are watching this and they can actually see our cameras, I see that you have this giant black square behind you. And typically, what happens in calls like this, and I see this all the time with especially new salespeople, is they'll get on and they'll recognize something in my background. They'll say, "Man, that's a great sign," or "Wow, that's a lot of books back there. What are you reading?" Or "What's this book right here, neuroselling?" Right? And they'll just pull something from the background. With you, in your case, I would just have to say, "Wow, that is a humongous black square. That's awesome." Right? So it's just
yeah.
trying to create a really disingenuous connection. Right?
Mhm.
So what we know to be true through multiple years of studying brain imagery and our different partnerships, especially with folks up at Case Western, we have learned and fully understand now that if all you're trying to do is build rapport, that you're going to fail. Because the idea is to really create connection, and that's the biggest piece. That if I can share anything with someone who's new in sales, is stop trying to be a really good salesperson, right? Start learning how to connect with people more authentically and more effectively. If you can do that, people will end up buying your product regardless, right?
Mhm.
Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to connect with that individual at a different level, but it can't necessarily be about you. And so the first thing we talk through when we're talking about creating a personal connection story is you want to establish some values, right? Some specific universal values that everybody holds dear. So for me, with my grandfather, it was servant leadership, right? I saw him out on the job site every day. He was out there serving his team. serving the cruise. He was the first to arrive, last to leave. That type of mentality. I learned that from him. I also learned about encouragement from him, seeing him constantly reinforcing and encouraging the people on his cruise.
Mhm.
And I also then experienced and learned what a real hard day's work was. I was 13. My hardest day's work back then was I just put 12 hours into the latest Legend of Zelda game. Like that was some intense work,
But
right?
then work. You put the
Right.
work in.
A lot of mental energy. So,
Uh-huh.
but when I went out there, I learned, wow, this is legit physical labor. And
Mhm.
so when I talk through the story, if you want to really connect with someone, number one is figure out a couple of really key values that you can state that you feel someone will connect with, right?
Mhm.
So, and there's hundreds of them literally that you can choose from. Those are just the three that I chose because they coincide directly with my grandfather. So my grandfather, who we call you needed to develop a personal sage. Like who is that person in your life that modeled for you what it was to be and help you become who you are today? Doesn't matter if you're a man, a woman, it makes no difference. That you have people in your life that have stepped in at different points in time that you have modeled something after. And for me, it just so happens my grandfather was just a huge influence in me growing up, right? Through those key years, kind of my early teenage years. And I have other sages. My father is one. I have an old teacher that's one too. So I have different sages depending on who it is I'm speaking to, right? But the key point is one, you want to have that person and make the story about them. Because Matt, nobody wants to hear about you, right? Here's what I've done. I graduated summa cum laude from here, and I have a degree from this place, and I know this person, and I nobody cares, right? No one cares. But when you start talking about how someone influenced your life, that story
Mhm.
now becomes much more impactful
Mhm.
because of what you learned and then what you're going to demonstrate in your relationship with this person. That's really what you're kind of subconsciously telling them to say, hey, look, this is what I learned from my grandfather. And so this is what you're going to get from me.
Yeah, I
That's
really like
creating,
the book.
right? That's creating connection. And
Mhm.
so those are
Like
those are steps that we put in as far as, how do we really teach people how to genuinely connect up front in a conversation? Or, man, in some instances, it's 20 years later. It would blow your mind if you have even a client that you've worked with for 20 years. And I'll challenge some people on this is to go in and share some type of personal connection story about yourself and then ask them about them. And you will learn something that
Mhm.
you've never known before, and you'll connect at an even deeper level because it's
Yeah,
genuine, it's not superficial, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so,
I
without getting into all the kind of nuts and bolts of how it works, that is really what the power of a personal connection story is when you're starting off any conversation. Because the why is so much more interesting than the what, right?
exactly.
How many parties have you been to where you go up and you don't really know what to say, and so what's the standard response? Hey, nice to meet you. So,
What do you do?
what
What do you
man,
What is it?
I
Well,
do
no, 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 no.
communications training. Oh, cool. What do you do? Oh, I build AI stuff. Awesome. How about that weather? Right. And then it defaults to
Right.
weather where everybody's at
Football.
or football
Shout out
or something.
bro.
Right. And so
And
it's this very pre-programmed, superficial level experience. And then you go in, but you change that conversation.
Mhm.
And I challenge people to do this all the time is that when you meet somebody new for the first time, say, hey, nice to meet you. So tell me what it is you do. Well, I'm an engineer at GE. Very cool. Well, tell you what, it's really interesting, but the more interesting story, in my opinion, is why are you an engineer at GE? What got you into engineering?
Mhm.
And you will shock people when you ask that question because they won't know. Some of them will just freeze like deer in a
Mhm.
headlight. I don't know. No one's ever asked me that before.
Mhm.
I went to school here and I met this one professor, and sometimes it will automatically lead back to someone else who they modeled their life after. And it draws out this entire really cool story that allows you to create trust at a whole new level,
Mhm.
right? It's
It's
it's gen-
not intrusive.
no,
Like, people pause like that. They're not like, I don't want to tell us that. Da, 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 da." They're just processing why, and they probably feel more uh, like gratitude that they're even like able to think about the why with somebody else than just have some surface level conversation.
100% because in all reality, unless you get a really super introverted person, most people's favorite conversation is themselves.
Hmm.
But how do you get into the real depth of what that conversation is? It's
Right.
a great lead in to do that because you'll get
Right.
some people to go, wow, no one's ever asked me that before. You'll get these different facial reactions. And it's just like, it's like they open up and it's a really
Uh-huh.
cool thing to try. And a buddy of mine, Dan, did this. He actually wrote an entire blog article about it that almost went viral. Like it was a really great blog article, but he went back to his high school reunion and the janitor who he went to school with was still there. And so he
Okay.
went up there and he said, "Hey," he started talking to him and he asked me, he said, "So why are you a janitor?" And this guy tells this amazing story about being able to serve the school and why he continues to be there and being able to see the students. He wanted to create an environment that's safe for them to be in. And
Hmm.
it's just this beautiful story that he shared. And he has been doing it for almost 30 years. And he tells Dad, no one's ever asked me that question before.
Yeah.
So you want to talk about leaving an impression on somebody? I promise you that guy will remember Dan the rest of his life just for asking that one
Rest of
question.
his life. And I think people are itching to have more genuine, authentic, just deeper conversation. And it's one of those things where people don't have the tools and the knowledge to understand how to even get there with someone.
Right.
Right. And one of the things that you guys are preaching is the types of questions and the types of frameworks to actually open up a conversation to a deeper place. Because yeah, you can talk about the surface level of all the masks and all the accolades that you can put on, or you can talk about what got you there
Yeah.
and the deeper meaning of that. So it's something I'm a really big supporter of. And if you do read the book and join Brain Trust Academy, it's going to feel very unnatural at the beginning. I remember starting sales with Suede and being like, I'm just going to freaking dive in and let me just see if this actually works. Cause obviously a little skeptical, like, yeah, the book and yeah, the videos and okay, that's great, but is it going to work for me? And I'm just going to dive in. And the first time I did this, I told my why story, opened up the conversation that I asked why you do what they do, why you do what you do, prospect. And she just opened up and told me things that I never would have thought that someone would tell someone who they literally just met. And it just created a deeper connection, and almost something of a friendship, like a long-term friendship between us. And I do it on my calls, every single discovery call. I always make sure to do it because it works. It truly, truly, truly works. Maybe uncomfortable at first, but trust me, the results are there. So yeah.
Yeah, you can't argue with the science, right? Like the brain does certain things in a certain way, and when you understand how that works, it can change completely how you have those conversations, right?
Are we
And
able to
that
dive into that? Because you mentioned studying brain imagery and you mentioned
Yep,
Case Western. Tell us a little bit of the science behind
little
why
the
story.
voodoo.
Yeah, yeah. I know you got any PowerPoints or anything, but just give us a visual.
So I guess the biology of the brain is probably where we should start, right? Like I'm not going to go into a huge in depth thing here, but what they've discovered and what they know to be true now in the neuroscience space and the biology of the brain is that a lot of us grew up either with the understanding that you got a right brain, left brain, right? So you've got either like a really creative side and then an analytical side or data driven side. And then once that was pretty much debunked, they came up with what was called the triune theory, which it was you had the neocortex, you had the limbic system, and then you had the root brain, and each one of them had different accolades and features to it, right? And what they've figured out it was really about 2018, 2019, is that they discovered to gear more back towards the two hemispheres of the brain, but instead of it being two hemispheres, it's actually two networks. So there's two networks that are happening inside the brain at the same time. You have your analytical network and you have your empathic network, right? And the interesting reason I bring that up is there's a lot to unfold, like unpack there. But the point that's really interesting for salespeople to understand is that the two networks cannot fire and activate at the same time,
Mhm,
right? So you're either toggling one or you're toggling the other.
mhm.
Now, you can vacillate between the two very, very quickly, but only one fires at the same time. And what's interesting is that when you get into a conversation, any type of sales conversation, typically what happens is that you have a salesperson who comes in and we do the report thing up front, right? Like, hey, weather, hey, I'm from Cincinnati. Hey, right. You know, you're just creating this superficial piece.
Mhm.
Then what is typically the next step is, well, let me tell you about my product and its features and its benefits and how we think it can help you and how it can do this and that and the other. And what's interesting is when you do that, is that when you start talking about the features and the benefits and your product, and this is what it does, and here's the data, and here, like anything analytical driven, it will take you into the side of the brain that is actually not open to new ideas.
Right.
That is the most profound piece that I can probably share with any new salesperson
Yeah.
is that the part of the brain that is open to new ideas is actually your empathic part of the brain. It's where memories and um, emotions and some of your abilities to communicate through the five senses are all housed. And so when we say that every decision we make is emotional, it's true.
Yeah.
Every initial decision debates inside the emotional empathic part of the brain. We know that to be true.
Yeah.
The analytical part of the brain will then validate what that decision has been, but it originates in the empathic part of the brain. So if you're trying to share your product and you haven't taken them into the empathic part of the brain through the right types of questions and really understanding who they are as a prospect and the specific problems you're trying to solve for without drilling them with 20 questions, if you can do that, then what you'll do is you'll open that part of the brain up to it. Then you come in with all the features, facts, benefits, da 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 da, to help them, to help that part of their brain validate the
Right.
decision that they've already
Validate
made.
the emotion. Right.
Right. And so the interesting piece though is that when you get into any type of sales conversation, your cortisol levels have a tendency to spike,
Hmm.
right? It the cortisol in your brain, right? There's all different um, cocktails that can happen inside there through cortisol and oxytocin and norepinephrine
Yeah.
and dopamine. Like all these different concoctions can happen. But when you're under any level of stress, your fight or flight trigger, which is cortisol, activates and it'll start to flood your system. And what's interesting, one of the interesting side effects to cortisol is that it puts you in a position that you will then communicate at your highest level of training. And what is most salespeople's highest level of training? Their product, their
Benefits,
features,
feature,
their benefits, all those things, right?
plays,
And
all the
you
stuff.
get you get a
Yeah.
you get a cortisol spike, and you sit there and you go, okay, I go straight to my product feature services, and you just start data dumping on people, and you wonder why
Uh-huh.
they're closed minded to what it is you're trying to do. It's also
Right.
the reason why later that evening, when you go to take a shower and you're in a relaxed state and your cortisol levels drop, you start playing that game of, man, why didn't I ask this question? Oh man, why didn't I do this? And it's because your cortisol isn't blocking that type of mentality from happening because you have escalated cortisol, it's forcing you in a position of whatever it is you know best and what you've been trained highest on is how you will verbally communicate. And
And
so
that's
that's
good.
why it's so important. That's why it's so important to understand communication training skills, not
Mhm.
just your product. Because if all you
Mhm.
really, if you're a master of your product, which you should be, great, but that shouldn't be the superior part of the conversation, right? What I mean by that is that your default should be communicate, like connecting and communicating effectively, not talking
Right.
about how amazing your product is.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And just understanding that the empathetic side of your brain is the only side that is open to new ideas is a really big key takeaway that I think the audience should really adhere to. Because I was just in a conversation this morning with someone who was gearing us toward the feature benefit route. Does it integrate with this? Okay. Can it do this? Okay. What about this? And my Jeff conscious in the back of my brain was like, no, we got to take a step back, Matt. And I said, all right, those are great questions. I want to take a step back. What are your top priorities as a business right now? And really just like opened up the conversation more, instead of creating just these small little pockets where we can analyze or quickly validate or unvalidate Suede. Like, oh, they don't integrate with this. Okay, it doesn't work for us. It's like, no, 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 no. Let's talk about the overarching picture of your business, understand your goals and your vision of your business, and then decide what is the best path forward for you, in the future. So it's really important to have that in the back of your mind.
Yeah.
Like, hey, make sure you take a step back. Don't feature dump. Don't benefit dump. You gotta learn about them and the prospects, not just talk about yourself. So I
And
love
you
it.
bring up a great point is that you controlled that conversation, right?
Mhm.
Like you knew
That's
what you were
something that
trying,
you have to just do too. Being
right?
able to
Is that
have
without being,
the
without
backbone.
being a jerk, right? So how can you still control the conversation? And by having the
Mhm.
right framework in how you structure your conversations will allow you to do that. If you don't have a framework, if you just go in with this kind of idea that, okay, I'm just going to sell my product, you are leaving cash on the table.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times you'll justify it at the end, like, well, that person, the timing wasn't right, or they didn't have the budget, or yeah, that may all be true, but those aren't objections. Those are barriers, and barriers can be overcome. And if you can
Mm.
overcome those barriers by adjusting the anchor in which they've set that barrier to, I'm telling you, you can close more deals than you ever have. But you have to understand how to do that.
Oh yeah. So you speak about the framework. Let's dive into the different components of the brain trust methodology. So we talked about the prospect story, the personal connection story. What comes next? After you tell that why story, you really open up the conversation and build that authenticity and that trust. What do you do next?
Yeah. So that's the whole key really to the personal connection piece, right? Is how do you establish trust faster and how do you connect at a higher level, right? Once that's done, again, the majority of what people do is then they go in some way, shape, or form about themselves or their product. And that is a mistake. What you want to come in is, and we call it the prospect story, right? So you come in very prepared to your conversation with your understanding of what their specific goals and challenges are that they need to be solved on a daily basis as someone in that role, right? So if you're talking to, let's say, I don't know, the CEO of a small business or the director of maintenance at a large company, or it doesn't matter who, what you want to do is you want to understand that role, right? And what I mean by that is put yourself in their seat. If you are the CEO of a small business that's trying to run, what are the top three goals you have every single day? Right? What are those top three goals? Is it making sure revenue is taken care of? Is it making sure that you're able to make payroll that week? Is it making sure that the new product launch is going correctly? Right? I mean, there's dozens of different things, but in your mind, for that person, when they wake up every morning, what are the goals that they are trying to accomplish? Then it's understanding what are the challenges that prevent those goals from being accomplished.
Mm.
And if you can verbally communicate with that person that you understand the world in which they live, even if all of them are correct, it opens up an entirely new level of dialogue that you've never had with your clients before.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
So once you establish the prospect story, then we move into the problem story. And that is then really flushing out that key problem. And there's a lot of great ways to do that with specific questions and kind of understanding the framework of where to take that conversation. But once you flush that piece out, the true problem, then you go into your product proof story, right? That's when your stuff comes into play because now you're going to help solve that problem. But in no way, shape, or form do you bring up you or your stuff until you hit that point.
Which can be hard because
Really
during
hard.
their during their soliloquies and monologues about their business and the problems and the challenges, your brain's going to be like, we can solve that. We can solve that. We can solve that. And then you just want to
Absolutely.
dive into the product and be like, we are your savior. But that is not, that is not good sales practice.
It's not.
It's quick practice to hold yourself back. But trust me, the more the prospect is given the floor to just talk, to vent, and the more you're there to ask questions and to reinforce and to validate what you're hearing,
Yeah.
more likely that the deal's going to close.
Yeah.
So
And you bring up a great point too there, right? The questions are key. And this shouldn't be a 20 questions type iteration when you're talking with people.
yeah,
Shame on you if you don't understand their company, their business, who they are, what they do, right? A good salesperson goes in and understands all of those dynamics. Because the last thing you want to do is come in and ask the question, so how long have you been here? Hey, tell me about your company. I see
right.
people that make ridiculous incomes still asking these types of questions. So, I understand you sell this widget. What, who's your biggest client? And unfortunately, these individuals get asked those questions all the time.
Hmm.
But when you have an actual framework that you're going through and you're leading them through it, and you ask really insightful questions, it's super interesting to see what happens. There's something that's called instinctive elaboration, and instinctive elaboration it's a fun term to throw around. But what it means is that you're hijacking their brain for just
Yeah.
a brief second. You're hijacking their brain with a question that you ask, and they're making judgments based off that question. And a lot of the times, people will sit there and make the judgment of, "Oh my gosh, why do I have to answer this question?"
Mm.
But they still answer it. However, you're in a really good conversation when they come back and you hear the magic words. You know what? That's a really good question. You want to change the dynamic of your conversations with people, get people saying that back to you. And if you're
Hmm.
not getting that, you're asking the wrong questions.
Hmm.
You're asking the same questions everyone else is asking. You're asking the same questions that your competitors are asking. And then you're wondering why you're just another bottle of water. And what I mean by that is when you're losing to the same competitors over and over again, a lot of the reasons is because your clients view you as a bottle of water. So when you walk into a gas station and you just got done driving for hours and hours and hours and you're just thirsty and you walk in and you go to the drink shelf and you open it up and they've got rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows and rows of water. And you don't want the flavored stuff. You don't care if it's alkaline versus, basic versus alkaline. I just want some water. What is it that drives you to buy a certain water? 9 times out of 10, it's price. And when you're losing on price, because you just become a bottle of water, right?
Right.
Water,
All these brands of water. I don't
it,
care which one. I just
I
let
don't
me
care what
see
it is.
$2, $1, 50 cents.
This one's 99 cents. I'm going to grab this one instead of the one that's $5. Now the $5,
Right. five
make
bucks
sure
is
it's
great.
not disease. I'm not even aware of it, but I don't even care. I just want some water. And so
Uh-huh.
that's what I'm basing this entire conversation on is water.
Mhm.
And when you're just a bottle of water, you're going to lose every time if you aren't the cheapest. So if you have a really good product, but you're not the cheapest and you can't communicate that differential and you're just a bottle of water, that might be why you're not closing as many deals as you think.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, you don't want to be a commodity in your business, in your prospect mind.
Yeah.
And the way you break out of that is one, your expertise and yours personal differentiator. And I really like how you put it. You need to come into your conversations prepared and you need to understand who your customer is and the challenges they're going through and really be able to speak to that and be an expert in that. Right. So there's the you aspect for sure. And then also just understanding your actual competitive differentiators and how those differentiators relate to the struggles and the challenges that the prospect is facing is also going to help you navigate the conversations and, you know, not fall into some of the holes and traps that you were before. So really get
100%,
into.
man. And this is better than myself, even though I play in the AI space and I like the AI space. You live and breathe that space with the tools at people's disposal through large language models. There's no excuse not to know everything and anything you need to know about the client you're talking to,
Mhm.
right? This isn't even about Google
Or the
searching anymore.
perplexity AI, type in the client's name and a couple questions, it'll pop up with crazy amount of information.
It is.
Great
It's amazing.
algorithm, but it's definitely going to change sales for the better. Um,
Absolutely, it is.
we're
Because
gonna be able.
more information is better than less information, but the right information is more important than the wrong information. So just because you have a lot of data on someone doesn't mean you know really who they are, right?
Mhm,
So you have
mhm.
to really understand what you're trying to accomplish in the conversation going into it. That's why the framework is so important.
Yeah, totally agree. Awesome. Well, I love the brain trust strategy. It's like a healthy in between of the challenger methodology, which is talk at your product 75% of the time, talk at your prospect 75% of the time. You need to be the expert and just talk, 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 talk. That's really what their view is. And then gap selling is great, but they're more keen on asking questions, and it feels more like the 20 question approach, which
It does.
again, isn't bad, but the way you guys preface the beginning of these frameworks is always great. It's something of like, as I understand it, if I was in your shoes, these would be my top three priorities. Boom, boom, boom. Okay. You just validated that you know their industry, know a little bit about it, but then you open up the floor and say, am I wrong? Would you add anything to the list? Et cetera, et cetera. So I really like the complementary approach there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's using the right questions to navigate yourself through it. Right. Questions are the most powerful tool any salesperson has in their toolbox.
Yeah.
And so you
Every-
need to understand and master questions. But really, and we have an entire course on this, it's pretty fascinating. We call it neuro questioning, but it's really what do certain questions do inside your brain? And why are some questions way more effective? And I'm not talking about closed-ended versus open-ended. I'm talking about legitimately the way questions are structured. Are they stacked questions? Are they individualized questions? Are they interrogative question? Like what is it you're really trying to do with that person in that moment? And when you know what you're trying to do and you have the tool to do it, right? If you've ever tried to build anything in your house,
Mhm.
having the right tools makes all the difference in the world,
Oh yeah.
right? Like, what's the difference between having a, a driver screwdriver versus some little hand turned Phillips head, like you're sitting there trying to, right? Makes all the difference in the world. The job can still get done, but is it going to be as good? The answer is no.
Yeah. I like that. Quickly before we move on to the next section, I'd love for you to tell the audience what you told me a while back around the what, the why, the how, the when type questions and the insights around that. I don't know if you remember it exactly, but I just remember gleaning a lot from that insight.
Yeah. So this was actually a study that I did myself over a decade ago when I was doing large trainings with people. Is I would always have individuals come in with bring your top 5 questions. Right. I want to see your top 5 questions. Bring them into me. What are your go-to questions that you ask in every single sales conversation? And before we even start, I would either announce or write the number 80 up on the board. And I'd give no context to it. I would just write 80. And I would say, okay, I'm going to randomly pick 3 people and I want you to just share your questions with me. So I would do that. I would just pick 3 random people and I would go up to the board and I would wait and they would say, okay, I'd say, give me your first question. All right. So, um, how long have you been in the business? Great. So I'd write something down. Uh, what is it that you think you need our product for? Okay, great. Write that down. And they would just go through their list of questions. And at the end, I would say, does anybody here know what this 80 represents? And no one would know. And I say, what it represents is it's 80%. 80% of the questions that you're going to share with me are going to start with either what or how every time. And I've done this for groups of 100 people. I've done it for groups of 5 people. and I consistently hit 80 every single time because every once in a while, someone will randomly throw in a why question or they'll throw in a where question, but it's always what and how. Always what, how, what, how, what, how, what, how. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with what and how questions. They're just not the strongest questions that you can ask.
Mhm.
And the reason is, and the real strength behind this, and real quick, is that I call it, it's the power of when. When questions will dramatically affect how conversations go. Because when you ask a when question, you are now you're now triggering what part of the brain? The analytical or the empathic?
When makes you think of a memory, and
And memory
memories
stored where?
or
Analytical or
empath
empathic?
empathic.
Empathic.
Yeah.
So now you're forcing them to recall something in a
Mhm.
memory. So you are planting them in the part of the brain that is what? Open to new decisions, open
Right.
to new
Oh,
ideas,
yep.
open, open, open.
Yep.
So I want to land them there by asking a question, and I call them stacked questions. So I'll stack them on top of each other. So when you consider using a new product, which of these three were the most impactful? Like, right. So I'll use when and which whenever I can, because which controls and allows me to create a finite answer.
Yeah.
By saying which, I'll get a finite answer, almost like a close ended question will give you, right? Do you like to read? You get three choices for an answer: yes, no, or maybe.
Mhm.
Right? That's the power of a close ended question when you need it. If you want a specific answer, yes, no, maybe, then that's when you use that. Which allows you to do the same thing, but you get to lay the parameters for what the which represents. So, which of these would have been best for you? A, B, or C? So that's the power of understanding what questions are doing inside the brain, because I can now modulate this conversation by asking you the right question at the right time to put you in the right part of the brain of where I need you. And there might be times where I ask other questions because I want you in the analytical. I want you validating the specific insight that I just gave you, or
Right.
validating the figures or facts or whatever it is, right? So it's about understanding where I'm trying to take you in
Yeah.
this. And when you control a conversation like that, you stop being a vendor
Mhm.
immediately, and you start to become either a consultant or, in some instances, eventually a trusted advisor.
Right. Right.
That's where
That
because you want to
that's
have
a fact.
long-term relationships with people, man, that's what
Mhm.
you want, right?
Mhm.
You want to be a trusted advisor for them. So
Right.
that
You want
I
them
would
to
do that.
introduce you to their team because the insights, just you yourself are worth it. Not just your product, not just what you could do for the future, but you yourself are so knowledgeable and trustworthy and I would say sage like or coach like that they want to share you with their team. So
Yeah, right.
that's awesome. And that's just tip of the iceberg of what Brain Trust has to offer y'all. So go to braintrustacademy.com. I believe that's the URL and
Yeah,
sign
or
up.
Brain Trust Growth. You can go there. You can go
Yeah.
to either one of them. Yeah.
And learn more. So awesome. So that's the framework side. We got a little bit of time here. I wanted to talk about two to three more topics before we close. So you've obviously been a part of consulting multiple different businesses, um, small, medium, large, so many different sizes. What is one common issue that you see some of these sales teams dealing with?
Um. So the issues I see them dealing with is that, first and foremost, they don't have a framework to work through, right? Like a lot of small business teams, it's either the manager figured out how to sell and now, or their top salesperson figured out how to sell. So they promote that person to manager because they want them to be the trainer. And then they're now pulling their top revenue generator off of the floor because they're now training people, but they really don't know why they're successful at what they do. They just are, and they don't understand why people can't just do what they do, right? They're what we call unconsciously competent, right? They're just unconsciously competent. They know they're competent. They just don't know why. They don't, and they can't figure out why anybody else is either. So how can you train someone to become consciously competent at what they're good at? Well, you got to give them a framework to build around. So that's probably number one. Number two for small business owner or small business teams is the the sales leader or the manager uh, doesn't have a good grasp of what we call, or not what we call, but what is called emotional intelligence,
And
right? EI is a huge factor inside not only small businesses, but large businesses in today's space. It's one of the biggest topics out there for mass, some of the largest companies in the world. And I'm not just talking about DE and I here. I'm talking about really truly understanding yourself and your emotional intelligence behind it.
mhm,
Um, one of our partners, he's a good friend of a lot of the folks here, is Dr. Richard Boyatzis. He's up at Case, and he's really the godfather of emotional intelligence. Him and Daniel Goleman. And so, we've had extreme great opportunities to meet and talk with these men and really understand. We have an entire course called neuro coaching that emotional intelligence is actually a part of. But it isn't just emotional intelligence by itself. It's the entire coaching climate that a lot of these small companies create, right? And what I mean by that is them really understanding how to ask the right questions and actively listen. Uh, but psychological safety is another huge one, right? Do your people feel safe enough that they can actually voice an opinion, or are they
right,
scared they're going to be shut down and fired if they voice anything that's different than what you have to say?
right.
So what is that culture that you're creating inside of your workspace? And that is just as, if not even more important than the external conversation. What is the internal conversation that's happening inside of your company right now?
Mhm.
And if it
Yeah.
isn't healthy and you can't keep people, then you need to figure out why.
Mhm. Those are two really big reasons. First, around training and coaching individuals. I, like you, see that all the time where there's a best sales rep. That sales rep gets taken into a manager position and just doesn't understand how to replicate their own results.
Happens all the time.
And the reason is because they have created a framework that's specific to their personality and their experience. So it's this, unless you're me, my way of thinking is not going to work to train someone up. And the beauty of a framework like Brain Trust or alike is you guys is agnostic to a personality or to a sales rep's experience, right? Your framework is taking a really big step back and um, you guys understand how to take any sales rep and convert them into a bestseller. So that's one thing I like about people who study sales, who study conversation science, is you guys are taking a look at the full picture and creating things that any salesperson can really grasp on. So that's one. And then the second about good co- good coaching and internal conversations is something that pops up a lot on this podcast. It actually leads me into my next question. It's around culture and sales, something that pops up a ton on this podcast. So you talked about it a little bit, but like, what does culture and sales mean for your team internally? And then you touched on a little bit, but also how do you help coach other businesses to look at culture and sales differently in their organizations?
Yeah. So look, it really starts with alignment, right? And what I mean by alignment is, and this is the first thing that we talk through with companies, and it's a bigger deal than most people give it credit for. But when you have alignment between what the organizational's goals are, like the organization as a whole, the manager's goals, and the individual's goals,
Mm,
when you have alignment on all three of those, it completely changes the way companies function. If you only have two out of three, poor dynamics happen,
mhm.
right? You have an employee and a manager who are aligned, but they aren't in alignment with what the organization is doing.
I like
So
that.
what kind of
Yeah.
headaches does that cause?
Right.
You have an organization and a manager
Yeah.
who are in alignment, and now you have an
Right.
individual who's not in alignment.
turnover.
But is it really that individual's fault? Maybe the individual doesn't even know what the organizational's values are. Maybe they don't
Hmm.
even know what the manager's values are,
Hmm.
right? You see that a lot. A lot of folks are like, I didn't even know that that was a thing around here, right?
Communication, man.
Communicate.
Yeah.
The number one determining success factor of any sized company is their ability to communicate effectively internally and externally, period. It is the number one determining success factor.
I believe it. Yeah.
Can you can you communicate effectively? And that
Hmm.
isn't just with your clients, it's with your people. Your people are just as important, if not more important than clients.
Right. Like, I want to see the stats on how many managers ask their sales reps what your goals in life are or where you want to be in the next 2, 3 years.
Brother, that is
Yeah.
a small number. I can tell
I,
you right
I,
now. It is a small.
I believe it.
And the
Hmm.
reason it's small is because no one's ever asked them. And the way most managers train is it's based off of how they were managed at some point in time, or they hated how they were managed. And so they're doing everything and anything not to be who they were managed by.
Hmm.
That is where the majority of the managers coaching comes from is
Yep.
just is just common sense. And I don't want to do it the way that person did. So I'm doing it completely differently. But
Right.
again, they have no framework to understanding how do
No
I have these
excuses.
really difficult
Yeah.
conversations? I have two employees that are at each other's throats. How do I actually maneuver through that conversation without that escalating into something? Right?
Hmm.
How do I really make sure that my employee is aligned with where I am with where the organization is if no one is communicating? And so yeah, it's it's
Very.
huge, man.
It's easy to become, because what at the end of the day, I believe it's all around being self-centered and only focus on you and the pressure maybe the company's putting on you. So you're just like, all right, I need this sales rep to do this and this person to do this. And you're not really thinking of them as people, but just means to achieving your goal, which is why you're not really asking them what they think or what they want. And that self-centeredness, you also see that in sales reps too, when it comes to talking to their prospect. That's where you get commission breath, right? It's like this sales rep is that I can tell all they want is the check that I'm going to offer them at the end of the day. That's it. They don't care about me. They don't care about my business, da, 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 da. And you really got to take a step out and become empathetic, increase your, what you call it, emotional intelligence, or EQ. And,
Either one.
um,
Yeah, either one.
yeah, yeah, and just understand how to communicate effectively. So you say communicate effectively, but that's an umbrella, and there's many different pieces within that to that make it what it is.
Right.
And again, shout out to Brain Trust Academy. Go log in and upskill yourself today. All right. So two more questions here before we hop off.
Good.
And they're fun ones, lighthearted.
Nice.
One
I like
is,
that.
yeah, what's the most fulfilling part of your work at prestigious companies like Brain Trust?
So I'm going to steer back to my why real quick is that the most impactful part of all of my consulting years is the fact that during my 15 years of doing small business consulting here in Cincinnati, I had the opportunity to actually work with three of the grandkids of people who sat on my grandpa's back porch
Oh,
all those years ago. Two of them, or all three of them recognized my last name and they asked if I was related to John Bittner. Two of them during different parts of the engagement actually brought in pictures of my grandpa with their grandpa and
hmm,
said, my grandpa talked about your grandpa.
hmm,
And so that from a fulfilling standpoint of just know, like that was exceptionally cool for me. Right.
hmm,
Since working with Brain Trust though, is that back when I was just doing regular consulting, it always came down to why did some things work and why did other things not work? And it was always this trial and error game, regardless of what client we went to. When I came here and began to understand the science behind how decisions are really made, it took all the guesswork out of all of that, regardless as if we're working with a Fortune 5 company or a 5 employee company. There is no guesswork anymore. because humans are humans, regardless on where in the earth they live. It doesn't matter. People make decisions the same exact way every time. And when
Hmm.
you can understand that, that turns conversations with people into something much more fun than it ever used to be. It removes
Hmm.
a lot of the stress. When your highest level of understanding is that you want to communicate effectively and you know you have the right tools to make sure that they understand what it is you're trying to accomplish without getting, as you would say, commission breath, right? How can I really, how can I create a real genuine level of trust with this person and be able to help them? That is really, really fulfilling. And so working
Yeah.
at a company that trains other people to do the exact same thing, uh, it's been awesome. It's why it was, it was interesting when I came to work here, I had offers at other much larger places. But when I
Yeah.
saw what Jeff and the team here was building, I was like, that's what I want to be a part of.
Hmm.
Right. And I feel like there's a lot of people in the small business space that have that exact same feeling, right? They're part of something that's growing. They're excited to be a part of something that has potential. It's in alignment with what they want to do. But how are you communicating that internally and how are you communicating that externally?
Hmm.
Right? You need to be asking yourself that question.
Hmm.
And is it as effective as it possibly can be?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And that's really awesome to hear that about your grandpa. It's
Dude,
always,
those were awesome days. Like I can remember where I was and like, yeah, those were
yeah,
proud days.
yeah. It's encouraging just to get that um validation on what you believe is true. And even from the brain trust side, you guys believe in this framework, you want it to work, and then teaching it and seeing people like me come back and say, this works. You guys are geniuses. I'm sure is also very, very, very validating. So thank you for sharing. Last question. What does it take to be a good salesperson?
Um, man, yeah, I'll tell you, I'm gonna rephrase that because based on this conversation and what I think people need to leave with is it's not about sales, it's about communicating, right?
Hmm.
There are 10,000 different books that probably more than that on selling, right? What I would recommend if you're really wanting to learn how to communicate effectively. I'm not saying sales books don't have things to offer. They 100% do, right? I mean, neuroselling is a great example of that, right? Neuroselling is a great sales book, but it's more about communication skills than it is about selling. And that's what you want to really dive into is really understanding not only yourself, but how to communicate effectively. And there's a book out there. Um, it's an older book, but it's called Primal Leadership. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not.
Mm-mm.
But it's by Daniel Goleman, the guy who I mentioned about with emotional intelligence. And primal leadership is not, some like big gorilla like pounding his chest and beating the ground and like it's not that type of primal. Think of it more as primary, right? And the primary
Okay.
piece of leadership that they recommend is understanding emotional intelligence. And it's a brilliant book on that. And so I would recommend that book highly. But what makes a great salesperson is their ability to communicate effectively in any circumstance, right?
Yep.
And the way you can do that is practice, 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 practice.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. It was a pleasure getting to talk with you. How can people find you and view your content and all of
Yeah,
that?
so I'm on LinkedIn. If people want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect with you there. We have a very active LinkedIn component. We also through our website, braintrustgrowth.com or Brain Trust Academy. If you'd like to learn more about either one of those, we'd love to have you, and you can connect on there. And if you'd like to just have a conversation with myself or folks on our team to learn more, man, we'd be happy to have that conversation with you. So yeah, but Matthew, thank you for having me on, man. It's your friendship's been a big part of our success here within the academy, and so thank you so much. And this was super fun.
Yeah. All right. Till next time, y'all. We're out.